On April 9, 2009, 42-year-old Abraham Shakespeare drove his fancy black BMW 750i car towards an upscale gated community in Lakeland, Florida. Abraham stopped his car, hit a remote control on his sun visor, and waited for the large gate that kept his neighborhood separated from the rest of the city to open. Then Abraham drove through the gate and glanced in his rearview mirror. His friend, Dee Dee Moore, was following right behind him in her black Hummer. Abraham led Dee Dee through the neighborhood's winding roads that were dotted with large two-story homes with huge front yards and swimming pools in back. Then he pulled into the driveway of his own house that looked a lot like the others in the neighborhood. Abraham parked his car and stepped outside. He was 6 foot 4 inches tall with long, skinny arms and legs. He had a beard and a black spandex cap that covered his dreadlocks. He wore a white t-shirt and jeans. Dee Dee's huge Hummer pulled into the driveway behind the BMW. Dee Dee got out and smiled at Abraham. She was 36 years old, and she was tall with dyed blonde hair, and she laughed and talked a lot. Dee Dee went around to the passenger side of the Hummer, opened the door, and took out a video camera and a tripod to put the camera on. She closed the door and then followed Abraham into his house. And Abraham led her through his living room that had high ceilings, large leather couches, and a state-of-the-art TV. The furniture, and most of the decorations inside, had come with the house when Abraham bought it. Abraham asked Dee Dee how her day at work had been as they walked up the staircase to the second floor. And Dee Dee told him that things were going really well. She owned and operated a successful medical staffing agency, and she said business just kept getting better. Then they walked down a hallway on the second floor into a room that Abraham used as an office and as a place to relax and watch TV. And when they walked into the room, Dee Dee set up the tripod, put the camera on it, and turned the camera on. Then she asked Abraham if he was ready for her to film him. Abraham looked at the camera, he grinned and said yep, he was ready. Since Dee Dee's medical staffing agency had taken off, she had spent a lot of time and energy following her dream of becoming a writer. She wanted to write books and movies. And when Dee Dee and Abraham had met through a mutual friend about 6 months earlier, she was fascinated by his life story. And she thought he would be the perfect subject for a biography or a documentary, or maybe even a Hollywood blockbuster movie. Dee Dee pressed record on the camera and asked Abraham just to talk about himself a little bit and to tell her about his life. Dee Dee thought getting Abraham to tell his story in his own words would be a great resource for her for when she started writing a book or movie about him. So Abraham started talking into the camera and pacing a little back and forth, and as he talked about his life, it seemed like he was almost reliving certain moments from when he was younger. And that made Dee Dee smile. And as she listened, she thought even his last name, Shakespeare, was perfect for a storyteller like Abraham. Abraham had grown up poor, and he had dropped out of school when he was about 12 years old to go work in the citrus fields that thrived in that part of Florida. And Abraham had left school without really learning how to read or write beyond the most basic level. And as he got older, he started to understand that his employment options would always be limited. And so he had spent the majority of his life moving from one odd job to another, trying to make ends meet. In the room upstairs in his house, Abraham stopped pacing for a second, and he thought back to some of the low-paying jobs he'd had. And he said going from job to job and struggling to survive had made it clear to him just how much the city of Lakeland was divided. Lakeland was part of the Tampa Bay area, and in Lakeland, some of the wealthiest people in Florida lived just miles away from some of the poorest people. And Abraham said when he was younger, he would pass by the gated communities where the rich people lived, and he would tell himself that someday he would figure out a way to move behind those gates. But it was a dream that most people in his poor neighborhood laughed at, and for most of Abraham's life, that dream he had seemed like it was impossible to achieve. But even though Abraham had spent decades living in his mom's house and working low-paying jobs, he had refused to let that bring him down. And everybody who knew Abraham said he was one of the kindest, most positive people they had ever met. Then, 3 years earlier, on November 15th of 2006, Abraham had been working as a delivery man for a food distribution company. Abraham's coworker, Michael Ford, had been driving the delivery truck that day, and he pulled into a convenience store to get cigarettes and a drink. But before Michael got out of the truck, Abraham had reached into his pocket and taken out $2. Abraham was pretty broke at the time, and he knew he shouldn't just throw money away, but he stared at the dollar bills in his hand and then gave them to Michael and asked him to buy 2 quick pick lottery tickets. and Michael laughed, grabbed the money, and went inside. A few minutes later, Michael had gotten back in the truck and given Abraham the 2 lottery tickets. Then, the following evening, Abraham had been sitting on the couch at his mother's house, watching the winning lottery numbers get announced on the local news. And he had just stared at the TV, stunned, because each winning lottery number that just got announced matched a number on a lottery ticket he was holding. At first, as the numbers kept matching over and over again, Abraham had kind of laughed it off and thought, this is not going to happen. But when they were about to announce the final number, he could feel his heart beating faster, because all he needed was one more match. He leaned in close to the TV and watched as the newscaster called out the final winning lottery number. And when Abraham had heard that number, he checked his ticket, then he checked it again and again. And then Abraham jumped off the couch and started shouting to his mother that he had just won the lottery. Abraham's mom came into the room and she thought he was playing a prank. But when he showed her the numbers on the TV and the matching numbers on his ticket, she started screaming and crying because Abraham had hit the $30 million jackpot. Fast forward back to the present, and Abraham smiled into the camera, and Dee Dee smiled too. Just hearing Abraham tell that story about winning the lottery was like listening to somebody describe a miracle, like something that never really actually happens in real life. But then Abraham stared down at the floor, and a look of total exhaustion came across his face. So Dee Dee asked him if he was okay, and Abraham told Dee Dee about what had happened almost immediately after he was shown on the TV collecting his big lottery winnings. Even after a huge amount of taxes and a reduced payout for taking his lottery money immediately instead of over several years, Abraham walked away with about $12 million, more money than he'd ever imagined having in his whole life. And with that money, Abraham had bought his dream house in one of Lakeland's beautiful gated communities for the rich, and he had gotten himself a very fancy car, that BMW. But soon after that, a lot of people had seemed to take advantage of Abraham's kindness. And he was lending money to friends, family, and people he had never met before, and he was paying for their mortgages, healthcare bills, college tuition fees, startup expenses for businesses, and just about anything else people could think of. And Abraham said that he loved helping people. He really did. But over time, it had just gotten more out of control. And now, 2.5 years after he had won the lottery, he said there were days where he would get hundreds of text messages from people asking for money. And he just felt like he couldn't say no to any of them. In fact, Abraham had a cousin named Cedric Edom who owed him thousands of dollars in mortgage payments on a house that Abraham had bought and let Cedric live in. And now Abraham could barely even get Cedric to talk to him, let alone get Cedric to pay back any of the money he owed. And Abraham hated that he felt like his lottery money was coming between him and his friends and family. From behind the camera, Dee Dee asked Abraham if he was tired, and he turned away from the lens, then glanced back and said he'd been tired for a whole year. And he said sometimes he dreamed of running away to a beach in some other country and just disappearing forever. Not long after that, Dee Dee stopped recording. She could tell Abraham was getting upset, and she felt for him. She hadn't won millions of dollars, but she said when her business had taken off, she had her share of people coming out of the woodwork asking her for money, and she knew that even for someone who was as good of a person as Abraham, that pressure could take its toll. And so Abraham and Dee Dee had talked for a little while longer, but not for the camera. And then at some point, Abraham looked around the room and then stared out the window at his sprawling yard. Abraham lived in a place he'd once dreamed about, and now all he wanted to do was get as far away from that house as possible. And after this day, April 9th, 2009, when Abraham and Dee Dee chatted and Abraham spoke for the camera, Abraham just kind of disappeared. And in the days and weeks following this day, Dee Dee, Abraham's mom, and some of his other close friends and family did get occasional text messages from Abraham, but nobody saw him or talked to him on the phone, and in the text messages he sent, Abraham always said that he was doing fine and he just wanted to be left alone, but he never said where he actually was. And so Abraham's apparent decision to just leave without telling anyone really upset his mom. They had always been really close, and she had talked to Abraham almost every day for his entire life. So now only getting a few text messages from him every now and again with kind of sparse information about what he was doing and where he was very difficult for her to deal with. But like Dee Dee, Abraham's mom had seen up close how people constantly came to Abraham for money and how that really weighed on him. And she knew Abraham had started to imagine himself walking on a beach where nobody knew who he was and where nobody would bother him. And so Abraham's mom and his other family and friends didn't try to find him. They just kind of respected that he really just wanted space. But then, fast forward to November 9th, 2009, 7 months after Abraham was last seen by anybody close to him. And on that day, Detective Dave Clark of the Polk County Sheriff's Department was sitting at his desk looking at a report that didn't make sense to him. The Sheriff's Department had gotten a call from Cedric Edom, Abraham's cousin who owed him thousands of dollars. And Cedric had said that his cousin had been missing since April, and he wanted to file an official missing persons report. Detective Clark, who had short blonde hair and a goatee, looked really young, but in reality, he had been in law enforcement for years, and he had experience with almost every kind of case. And Clark had a reputation for being one of the best listeners and one of the most objective officers in the entire department. In fact, during interrogations, Clark was known to give suspects every chance to tell their side of a story because he genuinely believed in the assumption that people were innocent until proven guilty. But as much as Clark had seen over the years, and as much as he tried to give people the benefit of the doubt, something about this missing persons report felt really strange to him. If this man was missing, why had his friends and family waited 7 months to tell the police? Clark leaned back in his chair and read over the report again. And this time, when he read the missing person's name, his eyes went wide. He grabbed a piece of paper and pen and started writing down some notes. Because Clark remembered something that he hadn't thought of in years. Clark knew who Abraham Shakespeare was, because after Abraham had hit the lottery jackpot back in 2006, news stations in the area covered what they called Abraham's rags to riches story over and over for weeks. So Clark now knew he was dealing with a potentially missing person who was worth millions and millions of dollars. And when that much money was involved, there was always the possibility of foul play. And so Clark wanted to get to work on this case right away, and he wanted to start his investigation with the man who had filed the missing persons report, because Clark was interested in finding out why, after all this time, Cedric had now decided to come forward and track down his cousin. A few hours later, Detective Clark led Abraham's cousin, Cedric, into an interrogation room at the Sheriff's Department, and Cedric was combative almost from the moment he walked in. He told Clark he didn't understand why he was being questioned, and he said he was the only one who seemed concerned at all about Abraham. But Clark just smiled and asked Cedric to sit down with him at a small table in the cramped, bright room. And then Clark said that they had contacted Cedric and asked him to come in because he was the one who had contacted them. And the police really just wanted to know what was going on with Abraham that had concerned Cedric enough to get in touch with authorities. Cedric took a breath and tried to calm down, but it didn't work. And in a very angry voice, he launched into an attack against a bunch of Abraham's friends, including Dee Dee Moore, and he said they were all really greedy people who took advantage of Abraham. And then Cedric said he was almost positive that one of them had killed Abraham and taken off with his money. Clark listened and let Cedric talk for as long as he wanted. And Clark thought it was a little weird how quickly Cedric had jumped to the conclusion that Abraham had been murdered. But Clark didn't mention that. And when Cedric finally stopped talking, Clark smiled and talked to Cedric almost like they'd been friends for years. Clark said he'd done some research right after getting the missing persons report, and so he knew that Cedric owed Abraham thousands of dollars in mortgage payments on a house that Abraham had bought for him. Cedric shook his head, and the anger in his voice came right back, and he said he loved his cousin, and he reiterated that he was the only one doing anything to find him. By the end of the interview, Clark was even more surprised than he had been by the missing persons report. He didn't have enough evidence to hold Cedric, but he thought if something really had happened to Abraham, Cedric had to be at the top of the suspect list. Here was a guy who hadn't said anything for 7 months, who owed Abraham thousands of dollars, talked about a potential murder, and then immediately tried to put the blame on other people. So Clark couldn't shake the feeling that Cedric might have contacted police in an attempt to cover his own tracks in some way. But Clark was going to remain objective like he always did, and even if he was potentially connected to Abraham's disappearance, there was also a chance that he was telling the truth. And so maybe there really were friends of Abraham who were out to get his money in any way possible. So later that day, the sheriff's department subpoenaed the cell phone company in order to get a detailed account of Abraham's cell phone records. But Clark knew that could take a while, so he dug further into some of Abraham's financial records, and the list of people who owed him money was astonishing. In the 3 years since Abraham won the lottery, he had loaned millions of dollars to people. And this was just in the form of property expenses, medical bills, educational costs, and other loans that had a clear paper trail. But Clark figured Abraham must have also been handing out money to people in his everyday life that he had not kept records of. So tracking down all the people who owed Abraham money would take time and resources. Clark was willing to do whatever it took, but he still had no evidence, other than Cedric's word, that Abraham was actually missing. Clark needed to get a better idea of what was happening, so he decided to talk directly to one of the people that Cedric had been eager to blame for Abraham's disappearance, Dee Moore. On November 10th, the day after the missing persons report had been filed, Detective Clark found himself back in the interrogation room. This time, he was seated across the table from Dee Moore, Abraham's friend who wanted to write a book and make a movie about his life. Dee had on jeans, a t-shirt, and leather sandals, and Clark thought she was almost the exact opposite of Cedric when it came to interviewing her. She smiled a bunch and seemed very easygoing, and she said she would tell him anything she could, but that she didn't really understand why she was there. So Clark asked her, when was the last time you spoke to Abraham? And she said she had gotten a text from him somewhat recently, and that he messaged her from time to time just to see how things were going in her life and to tell her that he was okay and enjoying his time away. Then Clark took a breath and got a serious look on his face. He looked right at Dee and told her that Abraham's cousin, Cedric, had said he was worried Abraham might be dead. Dee immediately looked confused and said she didn't understand because as far as she knew, she was texting somewhat regularly with Abraham. And as far as she knew, Abraham had done exactly what he said he was going to do. Take off to maybe a beach somewhere and never look back. So Clark asked her why Cedric would have filed the missing persons report in the first place and why he might have pointed the finger at her as someone who might have wanted to hurt Abraham. Dee just shook her head, and then she looked at Clark and said she had an idea why Cedric might come after her. Clark smiled, and in his friendly voice, he asked Dee to fill him in. And Dee said that she and Abraham's mom were two of the only people in his life who had pushed Abraham to follow up with everyone who owed him money and make them pay him back. They said it was one thing to be a kind person, but it was another to get taken advantage of. And they told Abraham that just because someone was family, it didn't mean they were entitled to get anything they wanted from him. Clark nodded and asked if that had caused problems in Abraham's life, having people like Cedric around. And Dee's voice got a little louder and rougher, and she said Cedric preyed on good-hearted people. And she knew that as much as Abraham wanted to see the best in others, Cedric would never pay him back a dime. Detective Clark and Dee spoke for a little while longer, and then Clark thanked her for her time, and after she left, he went back to his desk to look at his notes from both of the interviews he'd conducted over the past couple of days. And as he did that, all he could think about was how badly he wanted to see Abraham's cell phone records. Because Clark still didn't know if Abraham was dead in a ditch somewhere like Cedric wanted him to believe, or if Abraham was just sipping piña coladas on a beach without a care in the world. In the days following his interview with Dee, Clark kept digging into Abraham's financial records, and he and other members of the investigative team met with Abraham's friends, family, and as many people who owed him money as possible. But Clark also discovered something new that caught his interest. Michael Ford, Abraham's coworker who had used Abraham's money to buy the winning lottery tickets, had filed a lawsuit about a year after Abraham had won the lottery. In that lawsuit, Michael had argued that because he was the one who actually bought the tickets for Abraham, he was entitled to at least a cut of the winnings. But Michael had lost his case in court, and Clark wanted to know if maybe Michael held a grudge against Abraham. So Clark pursued this new potential lead. But he discovered that Michael and Abraham had pretty much lost touch once the trial started, and Abraham had even stated publicly that he didn't blame Michael for doing what he did. And he said he would have been willing to give Michael hundreds of thousands of dollars if Michael had just asked him, instead of going directly to the courts. Now, none of this ruled out Michael as a suspect in Clark's mind, but there was no evidence putting Michael anywhere near Abraham in the days and weeks before Abraham had apparently disappeared. So Clark knew he needed to keep looking elsewhere. And Clark still felt like he was in the middle of one of the most bizarre cases he'd ever dealt with, because no evidence had surfaced that suggested anything violent or against the law had even happened to Abraham. There was no body, there was no signs of distress at his house, and friends and family kept getting text messages from him. So Clark kept reminding himself that Abraham was a guy with the financial means to truly just disappear if he wanted to. But then, at the end of the month, something happened that would turn Detective Clark's attention back to one suspect in particular. On a day in late November, Abraham's mom contacted Detective Clark and said she had something to show him. So Clark drove out to her house, and Abraham's mom met him at the door and invited him inside. The house was warm and comfortable, and being there, Clark felt even more of an urge to discover where Abraham was, just so he could put Abraham's mom's mind at ease. Clark thanked Abraham's mom for calling him and for welcoming him into her house. Then she led him into the living room and picked up an envelope from the coffee table. She opened it and showed Clark a greeting card with a Christian cross on the front. And she said when she'd gotten this card, there had been a $100 bill inside of it. She handed the card to Clark and he opened it, and he saw a scribbled note that said, "I'll be home soon," and Abraham's signature underneath. And Abraham's mom said that even though her son had trouble writing, he had always made sure he could sign his name, and she recognized that was definitely his signature on the card. Abraham's mom told Clark that she had gotten the letter about 2 months earlier, but she had forgotten about it. She said she was sorry she had not shown it to him sooner. Clark said that was totally fine, and that he was grateful that she was showing it to him now. And he picked up the envelope that the card had come in, and he squinted his eyes, almost like he was trying to look for something that wasn't there, because there was no stamp or address on the envelope, and it didn't look like it had been mailed from anywhere. So Clark asked Abraham's mom how she'd actually gotten the letter, and she told him her nephew, Abraham's cousin, Cedric, had hand-delivered it. Just hearing that made Clark feel like his investigation had gone right back to where it started. Then, without Clark saying anything, Abraham's mom said that even though Cedric was her nephew, she didn't always trust him. And she didn't necessarily believe he was just trying to do right by Abraham by filing the missing persons report. And then she looked Clark in the eyes and told him all she really wanted was to hear from her son. If she could just hear his voice, she would know he was okay and everything would be fine. Clark said he understood, and he thanked Abraham's mom for all her help and told her he would keep her informed if he learned anything new. Then Clark went back to the station and he told other members of the investigative team that he wanted to keep looking into Abraham's cousin, Cedric, because giving Abraham's mom a card with $100 and Abraham's signature in it seemed like one more way Cedric could be trying to cover something up. And then Clark got some information that he was confident would break the case wide open. The phone company had come back and they provided police with a detailed history of text messages sent from Abraham's number. And something in those text messages stood out to Clark right away. And by December, Clark believed he was closer than ever to finding Abraham. On December 26, 2009, so a month and a half after the missing persons report was filed, Abraham's mother was relaxing on the couch at her house. Christmas had been a mixed blessing that year. She loved seeing friends and family for the holidays, but not having Abraham around just hadn't felt right. They had always spent Christmas together, and so the house kind of felt empty without him. But then her phone rang. She leaned over, grabbed it off the coffee table, and almost started crying tears of joy, because Abraham was calling. The connection wasn't great, but she could hear her son on the other line, and that was all that mattered. Abraham wished her a Merry Christmas and said he was sorry he hadn't called the day before. And Abraham's mom said that was okay, and that she just wanted to know how he was doing. And he said other than dealing with a little winter cold, he'd been great. And he knew him leaving had been very hard on people, especially her, but he felt like he'd made the right choice. And he promised he'd be home soon, and when he did, he'd be much happier than when he left. Abraham's mom hung up the phone, and she felt better than she had in months. And she wanted to call everyone she knew to let them know the good news. She had finally heard from Abraham. She had heard his voice. But first, she thought she needed to tell the police. So she took a deep breath, collected herself, and called the sheriff's department. On December 26th, right after Abraham's mom had gotten this call from her son, Detective Clark was sitting at his desk. His phone rang, and he picked it up, and he could hear Abraham's mom almost shouting at him on the other line. She told him about the phone call she'd just received from Abraham and how happy she was, and so Clark thanked her for letting him know, he wished her a Merry Christmas, and then hung up. But then, he immediately made a call to the cell phone company so he could get a location on where Abraham's phone had been when he placed this call to his mother. And when Clark heard what they had to say, he shouted across the room to a fellow detective and told him they needed to leave immediately. Clark and this other detective ran out of the station. They climbed into an unmarked car, Clark sat in the passenger seat, and the other detective drove, and before long they were peeling out of the parking lot and heading onto the street. It was a mild winter day in Florida, about 60 degrees Fahrenheit, but the sun was bright and Clark could feel himself sweating a little from the adrenaline rush. Minutes later, they pulled off the road and into a parking lot of a huge shopping mall. And when they arrived, Clark and the other detective saw the man they were looking for sitting in a parked car nearby. But before the detectives could get out of their car, the man they were looking for drove off. And so Clark looked over at the other detective and just said, "Chase him." So the detective peeled out of the mall parking lot and raced down the street after this man in the car. But the detectives realized they didn't have police sirens in their unmarked vehicle, so they couldn't signal to the driver that they were cops and they wanted to pull him over. So the detective just tried to stay as close to the man they were chasing as possible. Then finally they came to a red light and the man they were after stopped. And so without even thinking, Detective Clark threw open his door, he ran in front of this car, he held up his badge, and he yelled at the driver to get out and come with them. The man in this car just stared up at Clark, and then he slumped his shoulders and put his head down. And later that day, after they had all talked back at the sheriff's station, Detective Clark knew where Abraham Shakespeare had been all this time. Based on interviews and cell phone data collected throughout the missing persons investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened on April 9th, 2009, when Abraham first disappeared. On that night, Abraham drove his car down a road in an upscale neighborhood in a town about 20 minutes away from his house in Lakeland. Abraham had spent much of the day talking to Dee Dee on camera, and he was still thinking about getting away from Florida and kind of dropping off the map for a while. But before he did anything drastic, he wanted to make sure he had enough cash on hand to just disappear. And he hoped to avoid leaving a paper trail as much as possible, so it would be harder for people to track him down. So Abraham was on his way to the house of someone who owed him money and who had told Abraham that they had thousands of dollars in cash that they could give him. While Abraham wound his way through the neighborhood, the person he was going to see sat inside their house and waited for Abraham to arrive. And a few minutes later, they saw the headlights from Abraham's BMW outside. So they went to the front door, stood in the doorway, and waved to Abraham as he stepped out of his car. When Abraham got to the door, the person he was meeting with could tell that Abraham seemed down. But they said hopefully getting some cash would cheer him up. Abraham smiled and walked inside and followed this person through their living room and into a small home office. Abraham stood in the middle of the office, and the person he was meeting with walked across the room to a floor safe standing in the corner. Then that person crouched down, they entered the combination for the lock and opened the safe. And then they just waited there for a second. Abraham asked if everything was okay, and this person said, "Yep, everything's fine. I just need to make sure I grab the right amount of money." Then this person reached into the safe, slowly stood up, turned around, and aimed a gun right at Abraham. A look of fear came across Abraham's face, but before he could turn to run, the person shot him right in the chest, and blood began to stain his white t-shirt. Then the person fired again, and this bullet grazed Abraham's heart and perforated his lung. The shooter casually walked across the room and stood over Abraham, and they watched and listened as Abraham slowly died. Then the killer put the gun back in the safe. Then they went back to Abraham's body, crouched down, took his phone out of his pocket, and slipped it into their own pocket. Then they grabbed Abraham's legs and dragged him out of the room. Abraham was skinny, but he was very tall, so dragging him through the house was not easy. But eventually they managed to pull Abraham to the back door, and then they dragged him out into the backyard. A fence surrounded the yard, and it was totally dark out there except for some moonlight. So the killer did not feel like anyone could see them, so they didn't rush. They bent over, caught their breath, and then picked up a shovel that was laying in the grass. Then they started digging a hole in the middle of the yard. Finally, when the hole was deep enough, they walked over to Abraham's body, grabbed him by the legs, dragged him across the yard, and dumped him into the hole. Then they took the shovel and filled the hole back in. Later that night, they cleaned the bloodstains from inside their house and out in the yard, and then they found a phone number of a construction company that they planned to call the next day to place a concrete slab over the hole where they had just buried Abraham. Then the killer went into the living room, hooked up their video camera to the television, and watched the recording they had made with Abraham earlier that day. Dee Dee Moore, Abraham's friend who was an aspiring writer, had murdered Abraham. It turned out that months before the murder, she had convinced Abraham to give her control of his finances, and she had promised to play the bad guy and collect money from all of Abraham's friends and family who owed him. And she even agreed to hold on to a large amount of Abraham's cash for him in her safe so he wouldn't be tempted to just hand it out to people who asked him for money. And because Dee Dee was a successful business owner, Abraham had believed she would be better at managing money and collecting debts than he could ever be. So he thanked Dee Dee for her help and put her in charge of millions of dollars in cash and assets. And Dee Dee had collected money from people who owed Abraham, but instead of giving the money to Abraham, she kept it for herself. And she spent that money and some of the cash Abraham had given her on a brand new huge Hummer vehicle and other expensive items she wanted. And for months, Dee Dee had gotten away with it without anyone suspecting anything. But then, in the spring of 2009, not long before the murder, one of Abraham's friends started to catch on to what Dee Dee was doing. Because even though he was making regular payments to Dee Dee to clear his debts with Abraham, she kept asking him for more money. And when he got angry and said he had already paid what he owed, Dee Dee worried he would tell Abraham, and Abraham would find out that she had been stealing his money. So Dee Dee decided she would just get rid of Abraham, but keep collecting the money people owed him for herself. But in order to do that, she had to make it seem like Abraham was alive and just wanted his distance. And so when she filmed him on her camera, claiming it was for her book and movie, even though in reality she had no aspirations to write Abraham's story, she intentionally steered the conversation to how tired and frustrated he must be, and when Abraham talked about wanting to escape to a foreign beach, Dee Dee knew it was time to put her plan into motion. So she told Abraham to come to her house to get thousands of dollars in cash that she'd been holding for him in her safe, and when he arrived, she killed him and then used his phone to text his friends and family, and then she showed some of his friends and family the video recording of Abraham where he was talking about how he wanted to leave Florida and go to a beach somewhere and just kind of disappear and be left alone. And so naturally, his friends and family believed that that was what happened to Abraham. He had chosen to kind of go away. And Dee Dee almost got away with it. But once Abraham was dead, Dee Dee became relentless in her pursuit of his cousin Cedric, and she called Cedric and came to his house all the time, demanding he pay back all of the money he owed Abraham, and Cedric just wasn't going to do that. And so finally, Cedric got fed up with Dee Dee, and he filed a missing persons report. Now, Cedric did not actually believe that Abraham was dead, but by alleging that he had been murdered and pointing at Dee Dee as potentially the murderer, he knew that would launch a police investigation into Dee Dee, and that would get her off of his back for at least a while. And when Detective Clark got a record of Abraham's text messages, he was shocked at how well written and how formal they were. After all, he knew that Abraham still struggled with reading and writing. Then, when Abraham supposedly called his mother on the day after Christmas, Detective Clark got confirmation that what he believed had been going on was going on. Somebody in town had been using Abraham's phone and had been pretending to be him. And when Clark traced Abraham's phone to the mall parking lot, he and the other detective saw Dee Dee leaning into a car, handing over cash to a man and taking a phone back from him. And when they chased that man down, he admitted that he was a friend of Abraham's who Dee Dee had paid to call Abraham's mom and pretend to be Abraham. And the man had told Abraham's mom on this call that he was fighting a winter cold to make up for the fact that he didn't really sound like Abraham. Not long after that, Abraham's cousin Cedric came back to the sheriff's station, and he admitted that someone had paid him to deliver the greeting card that Abraham supposedly wrote to his mother. And it would turn out that the money Cedric was paid to make that delivery could be traced back to Dee Dee. And so Cedric had been right about Dee Dee all along without actually knowing it. With all of this new information, and with Abraham's phone records, police determined that every text message that had been sent from Abraham's phone since he disappeared had actually been sent by Dee Dee. And eventually, they learned that Dee Dee had hired a construction company to lay a concrete slab down in her backyard. So, on January 27th, 2010, over 9 months after Abraham's murder, police went to Dee Dee's house, and they broke up the concrete slab out back, dug up the ground underneath, and found the skeletal remains of Abraham Shakespeare. And pieces of the t-shirt and jeans that Abraham had been wearing in the video that Dee Dee recorded on the day she killed him were still clinging to his bones. Dee Dee was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Abraham was given a proper burial, and his family was finally able to grieve. And his murder helped lead to a new Florida law that keeps the identities of large jackpot lottery winners private for 90 days. And in a telephone interview from prison, Dee Dee surprised reporters and said she strongly supported this new law.
In the early 1970s, a man named Marshall Applewhite was fired from his music teaching job for having an inappropriate relationship with a male student. Shortly after, he admitted himself into a psychiatric institution where he met a nurse who worked there named Bonnie Nettles. Both had a deep interest in biblical prophecy, and Applewhite, after meeting Nettles, was convinced they had met in a previous life. Nettles agreed and took it a step further, saying extraterrestrials had come to her and preordained that she would someday meet Applewhite. The two did not have a romantic relationship at all. It was strictly platonic. They bonded over a desire to ascend to a higher level of existence and ultimately reach the kingdom of heaven. Applewhite began calling himself Bo, and Nettles became Peep, and together they would start an infamous cult known as Heaven's Gate. The premise of Heaven's Gate was that an alien spacecraft that they simply called the UFO was going to come to Earth and whisk away Heaven's Gate cult members, elevating them to a new world and a better life that they referred to as Tela, or the evolutionary level above human. There was a catch though. Anybody on Earth who did not get on the UFO whenever it got here would be recycled, i.e. destroyed, along with everybody else on Earth, and then at some point a new human population would grow, and another UFO would come, and whoever got on that would be saved over and over and over again. That was just how it worked. And Bo and Peep were telling everyone they talked to about Heaven's Gate that we're already in end times. Apparently there were signs that this UFO is going to be here any day, and so now is the time to join the cult. And so by 1975, Bo and Peep had recruited 20 people to be a part of their cult, which meant they gave up their families, they gave up their possessions, they basically gave up everything in their life and moved to Colorado to live in total poverty as they waited for this UFO to arrive. For 10 years, cult members waited and waited for this UFO that never showed up. And Bo and Peep are aggressively reminding people that this is the path, you just gotta stay the path. And then Peep unexpectedly died of cancer in 1985, which really screwed things up for the cult. In their doctrine, it was destiny that Bo and Peep would get on that UFO and make their way to Tela, the evolutionary level above human. That was their destiny. And now Peep has died on planet Earth. She did not get on the UFO. She did not ascend to Tela. She will not get to Heaven's Gate. Bo was devastated and horribly depressed, and it wasn't really clear what was going to happen to Heaven's Gate. But he composed himself, and he began to tweak his messaging a little bit. Bo began telling his followers that Peep had in fact ascended to Tela. Yes, she did not get on the UFO. However, the aliens must have given her a signal that if she leaves behind this human body, this mere vessel, you'll still ascend to Tela. Basically, he was preaching to them, if you just end your own life at the right moment, you can go to Tela too. But Bo didn't really know what the right moment was. He didn't know what the trigger was going to be. Until 1995, when astronomers discovered the Hale-Bopp comet was going to be passing by Earth 2 years later in 1997. And Bo saw this as the trigger. the UFO was going to be hiding behind the trail of this comet, and for sure, Peep was riding on that UFO, and as soon as it passes by Earth, we need to ascend. And so fast forward to March 26, 1997, as the Hale-Bopp comet passed by Earth, 39 of the Heaven's Gate cult members, including Bo, they began their journey. Bo told them they would be exiting the Earth in 3 groups. And so on March 26th, Group 1 entered their San Diego mansion and consumed applesauce mixed with barbiturates, followed it up with a whole bunch of vodka, and then put a bag over their head and waited for death. Then on March 27th, Group 2 entered the San Diego mansion, knowing full well what they were walking into. They all had specific jobs of how they were going to clean up the mess left from Group 1. They cleaned it up. Then they picked up the Group 1 members and placed them in beds and put a purple cloth over their face before they, Group 2, consumed their own applesauce mixed with barbiturates and put a bag over their head and waited for death. On March 28th, the 3rd group entered the San Diego mansion, and this included Bo, and they did the same cleanup as Group 2. They put the Group 2 deceased members in bed as well, and then they consumed applesauce and barbiturates, followed it up with vodka, bag over their head, waited for death. Bo had given special instructions to 2 of the members that were within that 3rd group to wait until he had exited Earth and take special care to put him in a specific bed, organized a certain way, and then when they consumed their own applesauce and barbiturates followed up with vodka, they should do that in their bed because they're the last 2. There's nobody else to move them. When a former cult member stopped by the San Diego mansion to check in on the cult, they went inside not knowing what they were up to and found all 39 cult members deceased, laying in bunk beds with identical black and white Nike running shoes on their feet with purple shrouds over their bodies, and they were all wearing matching armbands that read Heaven's Gate Away Team. Just hours before they exited the Earth, each of the groups would perform exit interviews where they would record themselves talking about why they were doing this, why it was important, and what they expected on the other side. They are remarkably cheerful and happy considering what they all know they are about to do. Here are some highlights from those exit interviews.
Okay, we have Thursody with us, and I believe that you chose the name Thursody because you wanted to be reminded of your thirst for next level knowledge. Is that correct?
That's right. I know my vehicle's, or this vehicle that I'm wearing is, pretty nervous, pretty scared. Some may say, well, boy, it's quite a irreversible step.
This isn't a troubling circumstance. Don't take it as that. It's just a gateway, just a doorway.
Okay, thank you. Now you're going to find this old crummy vehicle in a bunk someplace that I'll probably be watching when you check it out and observe your responses and your reaction when you look at these vehicles. And they're all nothing but containers that we've used and borrowed for the short amount of time.
People in the world who thought that I had completely lost my marbles. They're not right.
Our next story is called A Family Ritual. On April 9th, 2005, in Kaohsiung City, Taiwan, a young man was home alone inside of his apartment watching TV. And as he sat there watching TV, he heard a loud thumping sound coming from right above him. As soon as he heard it, he muted his TV and he listened for a second, and a minute later, he heard it again, a loud thump. And then he heard another one, and another one, and another one, and before long, all he heard was a succession of thumps and also what sounded like chanting coming from upstairs. However, as unusual as these types of sounds might be to the average person, to this young man, these actually weren't that weird. Because the family that lived right above him, the Wu family, were pretty eccentric. They were very religious people who often did these ceremonial dances and rituals at all hours, and a lot of times they involved stomping around and chanting really loudly. And as annoying as that could be, this young man never complained. He was very respectful of the Wu family, and he knew, these sounds he was hearing were connected to their religion, and he felt like that was none of his business. And so, like he did basically every other time he would hear these noises, he simply turned the volume up on his TV and tried to forget about them. But after a few minutes, it was like the noises coming from upstairs just kept getting louder and louder and louder until it was basically impossible to ignore. And then suddenly he heard a scream coming from upstairs that certainly did not feel attached to a ceremony. It sounded like somebody was in danger or in trouble or something. And so at that point, the young man turned the TV off and he stood up and he thought, I need to go up there and make sure things are okay. I mean, forget being annoyed. It sounds like, someone's in trouble or someone's hurt or something. But as he began making his way towards his door to go upstairs and check on the Wu family, all the noises just completely stopped and it was silent upstairs. And at that point, the young man just stopped where he was. And for a minute, he just listened, waiting to see if maybe the noises would pick back up again. But they didn't. And so the young man just turned around, walked back to his seat, and turned the TV back on. 2 days later, on April 11th, that same young man was back home all alone, watching TV yet again, when, once again, he heard a loud pounding sound. Except this time, it was not coming from upstairs, it was coming from his front door. Somebody was hammering on his front door trying to get his attention. And so the young man turned off the TV, he got up, and he went over to his door, he opened it up, and standing there on the landing was this middle-aged man named Wu Shan, who was the patriarch of the Wu family upstairs. And Wu Shan looked absolutely horrible. He was dressed all in black head to toe, but he was pale and skinny and very gaunt, and he was covered in what looked like filth, like food and ash, and he smelled unbelievably horrible. And the young man, he asked Wu Shan, hey, is everything okay? And remember, the young man's thinking about that crazy, loud ceremony they had just 2 days earlier, wondering, whatever happened with that. That was so loud. But Wu Shan just looked back at the young man with this kind of vacant expression, and he just said, call an ambulance. And then, without saying anything else, Wu Shan turned, ran down the steps, and disappeared out into the street. And so at this point, the young man is left just standing there having no idea what to think. I mean, Wu Shan did not look well and he's now run away. And again, this young man is thinking about that bizarre ritual he overheard a couple of days ago that just kind of stopped abruptly after screams were heard. Now he's being told to call an ambulance. And so he's thinking, I better go upstairs and make sure things are okay before I do anything else. And so the young man left his apartment, went upstairs to the Wu family's apartment, and the door was shut. But even standing outside the door, he began to smell that same absolutely horrible smell that he smelled on Wu Shan. So he knocks on the Wu family's door, he's kind of covering his nose, but he doesn't get a response, nobody comes to the door. And so after looking around, he just tried the doorknob and he found it was unlocked. And so, pretty apprehensively, but knowing he needed to see what was going on here, he opened up the door and right away he's hit with another wave of just this disgusting smell. He can barely breathe. But nonetheless, he steps into the house and he calls out to anybody, anyone come over here and tell me what's going on. But nobody called back. And he kind of looked around the family's apartment and it was totally filthy. There was just this grime all over everything. And he made his way all the way into the living room. And there he stopped. Because in the middle of the living room on the floor, he saw something that he just simply couldn't believe. It would turn out the Wu family had performed a ritual 2 days earlier. That was the sounds that the neighbor downstairs had been hearing. Those loud stomping and screaming, all that stuff was a ceremony like the family was known to do. However, that ceremony got totally out of hand. So in the weeks leading up to that ceremony, one of the Wu family's daughters came down with an illness. And because the family didn't have a lot of money, they couldn't send her to the doctor. And after a couple of days, when she didn't get better, the family decided that, okay, well, she must not be physically sick. She must be spiritually sick, meaning she was possessed by a demon. And so at first, they tried some ceremonies to ward off this demon, but it wasn't really working. And then before long, the rest of the members of the family began complaining that maybe they too were also possessed by the same demon. And before long, that was the belief that the entire Wu family shared, that they all were possessed by demons. And so on the day the downstairs neighbor heard all that stomping and chanting and screaming, that was the day that the Wu family performed a big group exorcism to try to get rid of these demons once and for all from all of them. But the way they did this exorcism was truly horrifying. They believed that the one thing demons were afraid of was filth.
And so they decided that if they filled their bodies with enough filth, the demons would leave. And so the Wu family, as they chanted and stomped around and screamed, began consuming their own feces. And when they would vomit it back up again, they would just swallow it right back down for hours and hours and hours. What the downstairs neighbor actually discovered inside the living room of the Wu family's apartment was the daughter, the one who originally had gotten sick, and she was laying on the ground and was deceased. And during the autopsy, they would discover that her airway was totally blocked by feces and vomit. By the time the downstairs neighbor made this discovery, the entire Wu family had fled the apartment. Wu Shan had disappeared after saying calling an ambulance, and the rest of the family too had kind of run off. But the police would ultimately track down all the remaining Wu family members and they would all be arrested. However, a court ultimately decided that the Wu family was suffering from something known as mass hysteria, and as a result of that, they could not be held legally accountable for what they did. And so, they were all acquitted.
The next and final story of today's episode is called The Helping Hand. One morning in November of 1997, a police captain named Jeffrey Lewis, along with his partner, parked their squad car near the Manatee River in Bradenton, Florida, which is a small city just south of Tampa. A few minutes earlier, the Bradenton Police Department had received a call from this frantic man who had said he had found something suspicious that had washed up on the shore of this river. And so Captain Lewis and his partner were there to investigate. And so as soon as they got out of their squad car, this man who had called the police, he saw them and waved them down, and he was pointing at something in the sand. And so Captain Lewis and his partner, they walked over, and before they even talked to this guy, they just looked down at what he was pointing at, and right away they could see why he called the police. Because there, sitting on the sand, was a severed human hand. And so the instant Captain Lewis saw this, his first thought was actually just alligators. Because there were alligators that swam in the Manatee River, and people were told about them and were told, not to go swimming here, but people still did. And so his thought was, well, maybe one of the alligators got a swimmer. However, when Captain Lewis looked at the hand more closely, he could tell right away that that probably did not happen. Because where the hand had been cut off from the body, the cut was almost surgical. It was very, very neat. Whereas if an alligator had ripped the hand off, it would be rough. But this almost looked like a surgeon had carefully removed the hand. And so what this signaled to Captain Lewis is this hand very likely represented a murder victim. Somebody who killed this person, cut their body up, and one of their body parts is now washed ashore. And so Captain Lewis turned to his partner and told him to call for backup. And within an hour, police officers were scouring the Manatee River looking for the body that belonged to this hand. Meanwhile, the captain bagged this hand as evidence and brought it to the county sheriff's crime lab, hoping that forensic experts could potentially figure out who the victim was using fingerprints. However, when he actually handed over the hand to these forensic technicians, they told Captain Lewis that it was very likely going to be impossible to try to pull prints from this hand because the hand was very badly decomposed and water damaged. But they told Captain Lewis that despite this being a total long shot, they would still give it a try. And so really all Captain Lewis had was this hand, and so he just kind of waited for information from the crime lab about the fingerprints. And before long, the waiting went from days to weeks to months with no fingerprints. And so with no fingerprints and no other breakthroughs in this case, Captain Lewis moved on to other cases. That is until June of 1998, when Captain Lewis was sitting in his office doing some work, when he suddenly got a call from the crime lab about the hand. An employee told Captain Lewis they had finally made a breakthrough. When they couldn't get the prints off this hand at first, they had moved to this very complicated technique where basically they would peel individual layers of skin off the hand and sort of piece together all the information to get a print. And amazingly, this technique worked. And so not only did they now have this print, but they had also already run this print through the Florida State database and they had gotten a match. The hand belonged to a man named Willie Suttle. As soon as he hung up, Captain Lewis opened up a new tab on his computer and began researching Willie Suttle to figure out who this person was. And he quickly found through public employment records that Willie had been a retired garbage collector, and then also Captain Lewis looked at police records and discovered that Willie had a minor criminal history. But what really stood out in his research about Willie was that Willie had never been reported missing. Willie had instead been reported dead. Right there in the public records that Captain Lewis was looking at, he found Willie's death certificate. And this document said Willie had died of natural causes 5 months prior to his hand washing up on shore. And also it said Willie had been buried in a local cemetery and no police had ever been involved in his death because no crime had been committed. And so Captain Lewis was baffled. None of this made any sense. If Willie had died of natural causes and been buried over a year ago, then how did his hand, his severed hand, wind up on the shore of the Manatee River? The next day, which was Friday, June 26th, Captain Lewis, along with a few other police officers, went to the cemetery where Willie had been buried, and they exhumed his casket. And when they opened it up, they actually expected it to be empty, considering his hand was already missing, so probably his whole body was gone. But no, when they opened it up, there was Willie missing his left hand. But that wasn't all. At the bottom of Willie's casket were all of his internal organs, just sitting there in a rotting pile. And so Captain Lewis is staring at this, having no idea what to make of it, but the first thought he had was, okay, maybe somebody tried to rob Willie's casket. But he's thinking, if they did that, why did they cut out his organs and stash them at the bottom of the casket? And also, why did they remove his left hand and chuck it in the river? Like, that doesn't make any sense. It felt like every clue Captain Lewis found was only making this case harder to solve. But he hoped when he sent off Willie's body to the county medical examiner that they would be able to provide him with some more answers as to what happened here. Later that afternoon, the county medical examiner would perform an autopsy on Willie's body. And the first thing he noticed when he began was that despite the fact that Willie's organs clearly had been removed, that Willie's abdomen did not appear sunken in. It appeared full. So the medical examiner started the autopsy by cutting open Willie's abdomen to see what was in there. And when he saw what was inside of Willie, he just froze, having no idea how to react to what he was looking at. He had never seen anything like this in his entire career, not even close. And so the medical examiner just grabbed a camera, took some pictures of Willie's midsection, and sent those pictures to Captain Lewis. The next day, Captain Lewis sat inside of an interview room in the police station across from a 45-year-old woman named Paula Green Albritton. Paula owned and operated a funeral home along with the help of her son, and she had been the one responsible for Willie Suttle's burial. And so Captain Lewis asked Paula about Willie's burial, and she would tell him that Willie had actually died in poverty, without any family members to help cover his burial expenses. However, when Paula had found out about this, she said she had agreed to do the burial anyways, for no cost, as sort of a community service. However, when Captain Lewis poked and prodded and tried to ask for more information about exactly what that meant, Paula would eventually concede that there actually was slightly more to her rationale behind wanting to do Willie's burial. It was not just for charity. 2 days after this interview, police arrested both Paula and her son. And at Paula's trial, the truth surrounding what happened to Willie finally came out. It would turn out Paula's funeral home business was really struggling, to the point where if she couldn't start generating some real money, her business might go under, and she couldn't have that. And so Paula decided she would conduct a prosperity ritual to right her business. But to perform this prosperity ritual, Paula needed a body. And so along comes Willie Suttle, who's died in poverty and his family can't afford his funeral, and Paula says, "Don't worry, I'll take him on for free." But really what she needed was Willie's body. And once Paula and her son had possession of Willie's body, they began the ritual, which started with Paula's son carefully cutting off Willie's left hand, and then the two of them cut Willie's midsection open, removed all his internal organs, and then Paula got out all these voodoo dolls, and she wrote on pieces of paper the names of the other funeral homes, her competitors in the area, and she pinned these pieces of paper to each of these voodoo dolls, and then she took those voodoo dolls and jammed them inside of Willie's abdomen in the empty cavity they had created, and then they stitched him back up. And then she took Willie's body and his organs and she chucked them into a cheap casket and had him buried. And then she also took the hand that her son had removed, she put it inside of a plastic bag, added some weight to it, and chucked it into the Manatee River. Paula believed this voodoo ritual would literally cause the owners of the other funeral homes, whose businesses she wrote down on the dolls and jammed inside of Willie's body, that this ritual would literally cause all of them to be struck down and killed, putting their businesses out of business, thereby leading to her business prospering once again. However, none of these things came to fruition. The ritual did not work the way Paula intended it to. Instead, the hand that she had thrown into the river ultimately washed ashore, and before long, the police figured out what Paula and her son had done. In 1999, so 2 years after Willie's hand had washed up on shore, Paula and her son were found guilty of desecrating Willie's corpse. Paula's son ultimately served 1 year in prison. As for Paula, her conviction was actually quickly overturned due to a technicality. It was discovered that during an interview with Paula, that police detectives told her that she could not be convicted if this ritual was part of a religious practice, that she was protected under the US Constitution. And so Paula, who confessed to doing this ritual, did so by saying it was part of her religion. She practiced voodoo. And so in court, that confession was ruled inadmissible. And so she walked free. In late summer of 1989, 39-year-old Bonnie Bishop dove into the swimming pool at her local health club in Santa Fe, New Mexico. It was just after sunrise, and she closed her eyes as the cool water rushed past her face and chilled her body. Bonnie didn't mind the cold. It was invigorating. Bonnie swam laps every morning. Then she'd towel off and hit the gym for a high-intensity workout. Bonnie was a semi-professional tennis player, and it was important for her to stay in peak physical condition. But this morning, Bonnie woke up feeling groggy, and she had a headache. She hadn't been sleeping well lately, and it was harder than usual to get herself motivated to go swim her laps. But she pushed through her discomfort and propelled herself through the pool, hoping that she'd just feel better once her blood got flowing. Halfway through her second lap, she finally found a rhythm, and her headache started to melt away. But then a searing pain shot through her midsection, like someone had literally slashed her in half with a hot knife. She was so surprised by the pain that she actually choked down some water. She tried to cough it back up, but then her entire body just began cramping, and she could barely tread water. Panicked, Bonnie began to flail, desperate to reach the side of the pool. But every time she tried to kick her legs, they seized up like the worst Charlie horse she'd ever experienced. And so pretty quickly, Bonnie began to worry that she might drown right there in the middle of this pool that she used all the time. Bonnie tried to calm her frantic thoughts and forced herself to just doggy paddle toward the edge of the pool, no matter how uncomfortable it was. And finally, she did get to the edge of the pool, and she collapsed on the steps in the shallow end. And as she hacked up water, a lifeguard who saw this happening raced over to her side. The lifeguard helped Bonnie up the stairs and out of the pool, and then guided her to a lounge chair a few feet away. Bonnie sat down and tried to catch her breath, but she just coughed up more water and continued to seize up in pain. She leaned forward until her chest was resting on her lap. It eased the pain a little bit, so she let herself sit there, breathing slowly. After a few minutes, the pain did begin to subside. She felt sore and very scared from what had just happened, but now she could stand up and walk. The lifeguard asked her if she was okay, and she assured him that she'd be fine, but she skipped the rest of her workout that day and just headed home, trying not to feel too rattled by what had just happened. In more than 30 years of serious athletic training, Bonnie had never experienced pain like that. Bonnie was used to being in perfect control of her body. She really didn't like feeling helpless or vulnerable. For a few hours, Bonnie felt relatively normal again, and she tried to put the incident out of her mind. But that afternoon, the intense pain returned. Bonnie realized this was not the sort of thing she could just wait out. So she called her primary care doctor and made an appointment for the following morning. The next day, Bonnie twisted in agony as she lay on an examination table at her doctor's office. Her muscles still felt sore and full of knots, and so she tried to massage her calves to keep them from seizing up, but nothing she did seemed to work. Meanwhile, every now and again, that incredibly sharp pain kept slicing through her midsection. When the doctor came in, Bonnie, who was all bent over and totally uncomfortable, explained to her doctor what had happened at the pool the day before, and how terrifying it had been to realize she could have drowned. She told him about the stabbing pain in her legs that made it nearly impossible to walk, and the dull but persistent aching all over her body. Plus, she was feeling so tired. I mean, she was totally miserable and had no idea why. Bonnie's doctor was puzzled. She was an exceptionally healthy woman with no chronic conditions such as arthritis that could have explained her painful muscle spasms, and his initial physical examination revealed nothing out of the ordinary. Her blood pressure, vision, and hearing were all normal. All she seemed to have was a slight fever. Then the doctor stepped back and frowned. He told Bonnie that he wanted to order a complete blood workup just to make sure she did not have some infection. Bonnie nodded, hoping that she would know soon what was going on with her. Her doctor told her that she was welcome to wait on the examination table and that a nurse would be in soon to collect the blood samples. An hour later, Bonnie opened her eyes and found herself staring up at the ceiling. She was totally disoriented for a moment and then realized she must have fallen asleep right after that nurse had come in and took her blood. That same nurse was actually now standing right beside her, and the nurse was apologizing for waking Bonnie up, but she told Bonnie that she really could not keep napping in this examination room. Bonnie nodded her head like she understood, and then slowly sat up to leave. But then a moment later, Bonnie's doctor walked in holding her chart, and her doctor looked like something was wrong. Bonnie held her breath as the doctor explained that Bonnie's blood had 10 times the normal amount of a special type of white blood cell called eosinophils. Eosinophils are supposed to fight off infection, and they multiply when the body is invaded by bacteria, parasites, or other enemies. And so this meant Bonnie's body was definitely fighting something. Bonnie braced herself as she asked, what does that really mean? And her doctor kind of looked down for a second, and then in a soft voice, he told her that an eosinophil count as high as hers could mean cancer. Bonnie was shocked. Before she started feeling this pain, she'd been perfectly healthy. How could she have something as serious as cancer? She put her head in her hands, and the nurse came over and rubbed her back. Bonnie could feel tears collecting in her palms. She felt like her body had been hijacked. She was an athlete. The idea of losing her strength and agility while she went through chemotherapy or surgery or whatever other treatment she would need made her feel sick. But, as a competitor, Bonnie took pride in being very mentally tough, and she knew that now was not the time to break down. So she swallowed her fear and sat up straight. She wasn't going to wallow just yet. Instead, she asked her doctor how they were going to fight this thing. Bonnie saw her doctor flash a small smile at her sudden fighting spirit. He said it would require more testing to be certain whether she really had cancer, so he wanted to refer her to the oncology department at the local hospital. Bonnie agreed, then grabbed her phone to call her mom, Jackie. Bonnie knew that her parents would want to drive her to the hospital and support her through whatever was about to happen. That afternoon, Bonnie felt like her muscles were on fire as she sat in the passenger seat of her mother's car. They pulled into St. Vincent Hospital in Santa Fe, where her primary care doctor had already sent over her lab work. Bonnie's mother helped her climb out of the car and then helped her hobble in through the front doors of the hospital. Thankfully, the receptionist told Bonnie that the oncologist was ready to see her right now. A nurse appeared in the waiting room with a wheelchair and helped Bonnie sit down inside of it, and then she wheeled her down the hallway to the oncologist's office. Bonnie climbed onto an examination table as a tall doctor with gray peppered hair entered the office and introduced himself as Dr. William Blevins. Bonnie reached out to shake his hand and then doubled over as a cramp made her whole abdomen contract. She groaned. The pain was so intense that she couldn't find the words to even describe it. Then she looked up to see Dr. Blevins watching her very closely. He asked her if the pain felt like a toothache, but all over her body. Bonnie raised her eyebrows at such a weird and specific reference, but she said yes. That's actually exactly what it felt like. Dr. Blevins nodded. He explained that Bonnie's high white blood cell count was causing inflammation in her organs and other tissue throughout her body. If they didn't reduce the swelling, the pain would actually only get worse. He said he was glad she came in right away. Dr. Blevins told Bonnie that he was going to test her liver, order some x-rays, and do further blood work. He said that if she really did have cancer, then these tests he was going to do would show him where the cancer was in her body. Despite the kind of frightening details the doctor was giving her, Bonnie tried to be optimistic. She was hopeful that if she did have cancer, that they'd caught it early enough to actually fight it off. For the next hour, Bonnie gritted her teeth as the pain in her body gnawed away at her. In fact, the pain was so intense, she barely remembered Dr. Blevins taking blood samples or the nurse escorting her to the x-ray room. Bonnie kept telling herself that soon they would know what was wrong and how to fix it. Finally, 30 minutes after her last x-ray, Dr. Blevins entered the office, and Bonnie steeled herself, ready for him to confirm she did have cancer. She could feel her pulse quicken and her stomach felt queasy. For the first time all day, she was so anxious that she actually stopped thinking about all her incredible physical pain. But Dr. Blevins said that all of Bonnie's tests actually came back negative. He'd even tested her for allergies, asthma, and parasites, but nothing showed up on her lab work. Now, they couldn't fully rule out cancer because there were some types of cancer that would not have shown up in these tests, but there were no obvious tumors on her x-rays. Bonnie's mouth fell open as she searched for words. She was encouraged that she didn't have tumors, but something was clearly wrong with her, and until the doctors knew what that was, there was no way to treat it. She clenched her fists, partially because she felt so frustrated, and partially because her body was in excruciating pain. Bonnie looked up as Dr. Blevins sat on his stool and faced her. He assured her that he was going to do everything he could to help. He told Bonnie that he'd already reached out to other doctors in the area to consult on this case. In the meantime, they were going to have to admit Bonnie to the hospital so they could help manage her pain, which meant she'd be staying for a while. Three days later, Bonnie lay on her bed at St. Vincent's Hospital, her eyes closed, imagining herself out on the tennis court. Whenever she needed a distraction, she liked to revisit old tennis matches and think about what she should have done differently. It helped take her mind off what was happening to her and the aching pain coursing through her body. Then Bonnie heard someone clear their throat, and she opened her eyes. She saw Dr. Blevins standing near the foot of her bed, and he asked her how she was doing. Beside him was a man Dr. Blevins introduced as Dr. Phil Hertzman, a family practice physician who'd driven in from nearby Los Alamos. Bonnie sat up and tried to say hello, but her voice was hoarse, and she felt totally out of breath. Dr. Hertzman gestured for her to just lie back down, it was fine. He told Bonnie that she really needed to save her strength. So Bonnie relaxed as Dr. Hertzman approached her bedside. He told Bonnie that he'd looked over her case and consulted with Dr. Blevins, and in his opinion, it was possible that Bonnie had cancer after all, though not in her organs or tissues. Her high white blood cell count could indicate that she had leukemia, which is a form of blood cancer. This potential diagnosis hit Bonnie like a tidal wave, especially considering the fact she had been told that she probably did not have cancer. Her dad had a friend who died from leukemia, and she knew it could be one of the nastiest forms of cancer to fight. And so Bonnie burst into tears. She tried to catch her breath and calm herself, but the tears just kept coming, and she started to gasp. She heard Dr. Blevins say he'd go get her some supplemental oxygen. Then a few moments later, she felt a mask slip over her face. She looked up and Dr. Blevins told her to try and breathe slowly. With the help of the oxygen, Bonnie gradually brought her breathing under control. She leaned back on her hospital bed, feeling totally overwhelmed. Once Bonnie caught her breath, Dr. Hertzman explained that to determine if she really did have leukemia, they would need to test her bone marrow, which required inserting a needle into her bone. He'd need some time to schedule the procedure, so she'd need to stay in the hospital another day or two before they'd know for sure. In the meantime, Dr. Blevins told Bonnie to try and rest. A few hours later, Dr. Blevins was finishing up some paperwork when he received a page from a nurse on Bonnie's floor. Bonnie's breathing had been getting worse, and now she could barely breathe at all. Dr. Blevins put his pager in his pocket and sprinted down the hospital hallway. He raced into Bonnie's room and found her leaning forward in bed, coughing and struggling for air. A nurse was hovering around her, trying to fit breathing tubes into her nose to administer oxygen. Dr. Blevins immediately grabbed a stethoscope and moved it down Bonnie's back, listening for any irregularities inside of her. He told Bonnie to please take in a deep breath, and when she did, he heard soft pops in her lungs. He grimaced. These sounds, known as crackles, meant that Bonnie's lungs were definitely filling with fluid. That's why Bonnie was having so much difficulty breathing. It was like her own body was trying to drown her. And that wasn't all. Dr. Blevins could see that Bonnie's body was swelling, especially in her abdomen. It sort of seemed like her whole body was filling up with fluids. Dr. Blevins paged the head surgeon and then asked Bonnie's nurses to prep her for an emergency surgery. Within an hour, Bonnie was out of her hospital room and inside of an operating room. 3 hours later, Dr. Blevins stood to greet one of the surgeons who had whisked Bonnie away into surgery earlier that morning. The surgeon looked totally exhausted. He told Dr. Blevins that because there was fluid buildup throughout Bonnie's entire body, they needed to completely open up her chest cavity to operate, instead of targeting specific areas with needles. When they opened Bonnie up, they saw that the swelling in her body had gotten so bad it was constricting her airway. Between that and the fluid in her lungs, it was no wonder Bonnie could not breathe. The surgeon explained that they spent 2 hours removing more than a gallon of thick yellowish fluid from inside of Bonnie's lungs, stomach, and liver. And while that would keep her alive for now, the fluid would almost certainly come back because they were not treating Bonnie's underlying disease. Bonnie's condition had now become critical. There was some good news, though. The surgeon, during the operation, was able to take samples of Bonnie's bone marrow, liver, stomach, and ovaries. It would let them test her for leukemia and other infections. Dr. Blevins hoped he could finally figure out what was making Bonnie's white blood cell count so high. But the next morning, Dr. Blevins looked over Bonnie's test results, feeling mixed emotions. There was no sign of leukemia in any of Bonnie's tissue, which meant that, once and for all, she really did not have cancer. That was good, and yet her biopsy showed that the specialized white blood cells, called eosinophils, had spread all over her body, and he still had no idea why. Bonnie was dangerously near death, and Dr. Blevins was very worried that she really did not have much time left. The next morning, Dr. Blevins knocked on the door of Bonnie's hospital room and then walked inside. He smiled at her mother, Jackie, who was reading in the corner. Then he turned his attention to Bonnie. He was shocked to see how frail she looked. She was sickly pale and too weak to even lift her head. Dr. Blevins gave Bonnie a half smile, but then he had to tell her the bad news, that he still didn't know what was making her sick, and he was running out of treatment options. He told Bonnie that he was going to prescribe a powerful steroid called prednisone to reduce the inflammation and swelling throughout her body. But privately, Dr. Blevins knew it was just a temporary fix. If they didn't find an answer soon for what this underlying disease was, he didn't see how Bonnie could survive. Now, a few days earlier, Bonnie might have broken down in tears at the doctor's grim message. But now, she just lay there, staring blankly. Looking at Bonnie's hopeless face, Dr. Blevins racked his brain for any possible avenue he had not crossed yet. Then he had an idea. He turned to Jackie, Bonnie's mother, and made a very odd request. He knew it was a total shot in the dark, but it was all they had. The next morning, Bonnie's mother handed Dr. Blevins a paper bag full of vitamins, painkillers, sleep aids, and supplements, all from Bonnie's apartment. Dr. Blevins' request of Bonnie's mother had been for Jackie to go raid Bonnie's cabinets and bathroom for anything that Bonnie might be taking. He wondered if maybe something she was taking contained an allergen or something else that was actually causing her to be so sick. Dr. Blevins excitedly dumped the bag out onto his desk and began sifting through all the plastic bottles. But as he read the ingredients on each of these bottles and the different things that were on his desk, he kind of huffed in exasperation. He didn't see any ingredient that could cause an allergic reaction similar to Bonnie's symptoms. Dr. Blevins leaned back in his desk chair, feeling frustrated. He felt like he was running into another dead end. But just then, the doctor's phone began to ring. He was going to send it to voicemail, but when he picked up his phone, he saw it was Dr. Hertzman, the family physician who'd consulted on Bonnie's case and suggested she might have leukemia. So, considering the circumstances, Dr. Blevins picked it up. Dr. Hertzman explained that a woman named Kathy had come to his practice that morning. Kathy was 43 years old, and she was having trouble sleeping. In fact, Kathy said that over the past 3 weeks, she hadn't slept more than a few minutes a night. Every time she began to drift off to sleep, she'd snap awake, feeling like her muscles were on fire. And now she was having trouble breathing, and she had begun having this agonizing pain course through her entire body at regular intervals. According to Dr. Hertzman, Kathy said it felt like she had battery acid under her skin. Dr. Blevins' eyes widened. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Kathy's symptoms were nearly identical to Bonnie's. He asked if Kathy also had elevated levels of eosinophils, and Dr. Hertzman said yes. Her white blood cell count was off the charts. Dr. Blevins realized that Dr. Hertzman was essentially telling him that these women's cases could be linked, which meant both women might have been exposed to the same thing that made them sick. But it also meant something else. The doctors could be witnessing the beginning of a new contagious condition, but they had no idea what was causing it. The situation had now become a ticking time bomb. Dr. Blevins thanked Dr. Hertzman and then hung up, but honestly, Blevins was kind of at a loss for what to do next. He got up to grab a cup of coffee so he could think, and when he got back to his office with his coffee, the phone on his desk was ringing. It was another physician at the nearby Women's Health Center calling about a patient referral. They wanted Dr. Blevins to take a look at a woman who had a high eosinophil count and extreme muscle pain. This woman had the same symptoms as Bonnie and Dr. Hertzman's patient, Kathy. But instead of feeling more despair at more people having these symptoms, Dr. Blevins suddenly felt energized. If he could find one single link between all three of these women, he could probably figure out what was making them sick. And if he acted fast, he could potentially save all of their lives. Dr. Blevins picked up the phone and made some calls. And within a few hours, his desk was covered in pill bottles, containers of vitamins, and sleep aids. These were all the medicines that were collected from all three women, the three patients. Dr. Blevins took a step back from his desk, and he noticed that all three piles from each of the three women had something in common. A blue bottle of an all-natural, over-the-counter sleep aid called L-tryptophan. And Dr. Blevins knew that all three women had been saying they were struggling to sleep lately, so they must have been taking this L-tryptophan right around the time they got sick. Now, typically, this supplement was harmless, but Dr. Blevins suspected that something about this one brand of L-tryptophan was harming these patients. And it was available on shelves everywhere, and so if he was right about this, Dr. Blevins needed to act right now before more people got sick. So he grabbed the phone, and Dr. Blevins contacted the New Mexico Department of Health about a potential outbreak. The Department of Health immediately began an investigation, and in November of 1989, about 3 months after Bonnie had first got sick, the FDA issued a nationwide recall of all products containing L-tryptophan. 6 months after that, the CDC conducted a nationwide study and found that all the sick patients, including Bonnie, had been taking L-tryptophan made by a Japanese company called Showa Denko. Showa Denko had been trying to genetically engineer a bacteria that, in theory, would help them make more L-tryptophan for less money. But the bacteria contaminated the batches, which caused 1,500 cases like Bonnie's, and of those cases, 37 Americans died. Because of this outbreak, L-tryptophan was banned in the United States until 2005. Since the manufacturing error was identified, there have been no additional cases of contaminated batches. Bonnie would be one of the lucky ones who would survive her illness, which is known as eosinophilia, but it took a long time for her to resume a normal life. She was in the hospital for a month before she was well enough to go home. It took several more years, but eventually Bonnie would make a full recovery. She finally felt in control of her body again and relished her active lifestyle more than ever. Also, thanks to the doctor's quick thinking, both Kathy and the other woman Dr. Blevins treated also made full recoveries.
Connection unstable, but I'm still here. Your face in the blue light, 2 a.m. again. I count the seconds loading just to hear you say my name. We talking low battery, promises on mute. I fall asleep with your voice still echoing through Trace your shadow on a glass screen. You're so close, but no.
Underneath the velvet hush of the midnight sky, we wander through the orchard where the summer fireflies.
From Ballin Studios and Wondery, this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, Mr. Ballen. A quick note about our stories: we use aliases sometimes because we don't know the names of the real people in the story, and also, in most cases, we can't know exactly what was said, but everything is based on a lot of research. And a reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This episode was written by Aaron Land. Our editor is Heather Dundas. Sound design is by Ryan Potesta. Coordinating producer